On the evening of November 22nd, 1987, thousands of people in Chicago were watching television. It was an ordinary Sunday night. On WGN-TV, the 9 o'clock news was on the air. The program had reached the sports segment. Dan Roan was talking about the Chicago Bears. Then the signal was interrupted. The screen went black for a few moments. When the picture returned, the newscast was gone. In its place was a masked man.
McMahon and McKinnon, 14-0 Bears. Then the defense, which hadn't put up a sack in 12 quarters, finally did. Well, if you're wondering what's happened.
An artificial-looking face. Behind him, a corrugated metal panel moved like an improvised backdrop. The figure resembled Max Headroom, one of the most recognizable television characters of the 1980s. But nobody in that newsroom had put him on the air. The audio was almost unusable, more of a buzzing noise than a voice. The man moved in front of the camera without explaining anything, without signing anything, without asking for anything. After about 30 seconds, WGN managed to regain control. The newscast returned. Dan Roan tried to defuse the moment with a brief line. "If you're wondering what happened, so am I." For viewers, it had been a brief and confusing scene. For the technicians, it was enough to understand one thing. Someone had replaced the signal of a local television station. The time most often given in later reconstructions is around 9:14 p.m. It was not a marginal time slot or a dead point in the schedule. It was the evening news on one of Chicago's most recognizable stations, and the interruption came in the middle of a sports segment watched by a large and regular audience. The first intrusion had an almost silent quality. The fake Max moved in front of the metal panel. The backdrop shifted enough to imitate the visual effect associated with the original character, but everything looked cheap, improvised. That absence of audio made the first attack more ambiguous. There was no speech to interpret yet, no name to follow, no local reference to decode. There was only the image, a masked figure appearing in the wrong place at the wrong time, inside a live broadcast. WGN reacted quickly. According to the most frequently cited technical reconstructions, engineers managed to interrupt the intrusion by acting on the link between the studio and the transmitter, which at the time was associated with the John Hancock Center. In practice, the station found a way to reassert its own feed before the pirate signal could go any further. That is why the first interruption was brief. But its brevity is exactly what makes it important. It was a successful test in front of thousands of viewers. The signal could be hit, and whoever had done it had managed to get in at least once. And that night was not over yet. Max Headroom in 1987 was not a random mask. For many viewers, he was already a familiar face. He had first appeared in the United Kingdom in the television film Max Headroom 20 Minutes into the Future, and then as a music video presenter on Channel 4. In America, he arrived with a television series on ABC and, above all, with Coca-Cola commercials. For a time, he was everywhere. In promos, in ads, in magazines, in conversations about the new electronic aesthetic of the 1980s. His image was built to look computer-generated. In reality, it was not computer graphics. Behind the character was actor Matt Frewer, covered in heavy makeup, prosthetics, harsh lighting, and video treatment designed to create the illusion of a digital face. Audiences saw what looked like a synthetic creature, but the trick was still television-based, physical, handmade. That made him perfect for the era. Max Headroom stood exactly at the point where advertising, music videos, science fiction, commercial television, and anxiety about the technological future met. He had the smile of a presenter, the rhythm of a commercial, the broken voice of a defective machine. He spoke as if television had produced its own host and then lost control of him. In popular culture, he worked because he was both a product and a parody of the product. He sold soft drinks, introduced music videos, appeared in a cyberpunk series, and at the same time mocked that very world. The perfect image, aggressive communication, the future packaged as entertainment. Whoever used that mask in Chicago chose an instantly readable symbol. There was no need to explain everything to the viewer. That character already belonged to the television imagination. The difference is that night, Max Headroom did not appear in a commercial or in a series. He appeared inside a hijacked signal. The parody of television entered real television without permission. About 2 hours after the first interruption, the face returned. This time, the target was WTTW, Chicago's public television station. A rerun of Doctor Who was on the air, the episode Horror of Fang Rock. The choice of program, whether deliberate or accidental, added to the strangeness of the scene. A British science fiction broadcast interrupted by a figure that seemed to come from another fragment of the same television culture. The second intrusion lasted about 90 seconds. This time there was a voice. Distorted, high-pitched, unstable. The phrases arrived in fragments. Some seemed like private jokes. Others invoked people and references from Chicago's local television world. One of the names mentioned was Chuck Swirsky, then a sportscaster in the Chicago area. Years later, interviewed by WBUR for the podcast Endless Thread, Swirsky recalled receiving many phone calls immediately after the incident, people asking him why he had been named by Max Headroom. At first, to him, it seemed like a joke. Then he realized that his name had ended up inside one of the strangest television intrusions in American history. That detail matters. The transmission was not just a collection of random noises. Inside that minute and a half were local references, jokes aimed at a specific environment, signals that seemed to be speaking to someone inside or around Chicago television. According to the reconstruction published by WTTW in 2017, Paul Rizzo, then the station's air director, remembered the confusion in master control. The content was becoming increasingly grotesque, and the technicians could not interrupt it.
I'll get you a hot drink, miss.
Some dry cleaning.
Oh, Jesus. What's the way? CBX. Oh, my files. Oh, I just made a giant masterpiece for all the greatest world newspaper nerds. My brother is wearing the other one, but it's naughty. gonna put my triangle. We're gonna go. They're coming to get me.
As far as I can tell, a massive electric shock. He died in...
The difference with WGN was clear. WGN had regained control after about 30 seconds. WTTW had to wait until the pirate transmission ended. The signal returned to normal only when whoever was transmitting decided to stop. Then, Doctor Who resumed. The audience was left with a simple question. Who had just broken into a television broadcast?
Broadcast engineers at 2 Chicago television stations and thousands of viewers are still puzzled today.
The hunt is on this afternoon for Chicago's video pirate.
Late last night, as followers of the British TV fantasy series Doctor Who watched an episode entitled Horror of Fang Rock, they were startled by this.
In 1987, local television used analog infrastructure. Studios, links, antennas, transmitters, microwave relays. Under certain conditions, a strong enough signal, aimed at the right point, could overpower the legitimate one. Put that way, it sounds almost clean. In practice, it required preparation. You needed to know the signal path. You needed to know where to act. You needed equipment capable of transmitting with sufficient power. You also needed some nerve, because the legal risk was real. WNG broadcast engineer Bob Strutzel, interviewed years later by the station, said that whoever was behind the intrusion must have had sophisticated knowledge: a television engineer, a satellite technician, an experienced radio amateur, or some combination of similar skills.
Chicago TV stations transmit from atop 2 of the world's tallest buildings. Engineers say the prankster employed sophisticated microwave equipment to override the signals beamed from the station's studios to the main antennas.
It takes a significant amount of power levels to achieve this kind of an interference.
The content of the transmission was rough, almost childish. The technical execution was precise. 2 stations hit on the same night. A first brief interruption on WGN, a longer second intrusion on WTTW. The effect is still strange today. Serious competence used to broadcast a ragged performance. The Federal Communications Commission opened an investigation. The unauthorized interruption of a television signal fell into a category much more serious than a prank. Broadcast communications were regulated, protected, and monitored. The possible consequences were severe for whoever had transmitted the pirate signal. Very high fines and even prison. At the time, there was talk of a maximum penalty of up to $100,000 and possible criminal consequences. But that threat remained theoretical. Nobody was identified. There were no arrests, trials, or convictions, nor do there appear to have been sanctions against WGN or WTTW. The stations had been targeted, not accused. For them, the most concrete consequence was technical and internal. Understanding how someone had managed to enter the signal and how to prevent it from happening again.
In a defense strategy, broadcasters here are employing new backup studio transmitter links, determined that this first-ever intrusion on Chicago TV screens will also be the last.
The investigators, however, had little concrete material. The signal had lasted less than 2 minutes in total. Chicago was large. The equipment could have been set up on a rooftop, in a van, in a temporary space, and then removed immediately afterward. Once the transmitter was turned off, the trace became weak. The following morning, according to WTTW, the station's technicians tried to understand how it had been possible. The definitive answer never came. The FCC never identified a responsible party. From that void came the theories. one of the strongest concerns the real target of the action. The second intrusion, the one that became famous, occurred on WTTW, but several references seem to point toward WGN. The name Chuck Swirsky, the references to local sports, and the phrase linked to world's greatest newspaper, the historical meaning associated with the letters WGN, led many observers to think that the message was directed mainly at that environment. It does not seem like a transmission designed for a national audience. It seems like a provocation built inside a local context, perhaps by someone who knew the people, the rivalries, and the language of Chicago television. Another lead points to radio amateurs. In the 1980s, some people outside the networks possessed considerable technical knowledge, frequencies, antennas, modulation, signal power. An experienced radio amateur, perhaps together with others, could have attempted an operation of that kind. Then there is the hypothesis of technicians, communications students, small video studios, experimental circles, people close enough to television technology to know its weak points, and distant enough from the consequences to think they might get away with it. All of these leads explain something. Decades later, the silence weighs almost as much as the intrusion. A stunt like this often carries a form of vanity. Someone, sooner or later, talks, keeps a souvenir, shows a tape, gives themselves away with a detail. In the Max Headroom case, the identity has remained covered. Many stories have circulated. None has produced verifiable proof. The video contains fragments, jokes, internal references, but it lacks a readable direction. No demand for money, no political platform, no technical manifesto, no signature capable of turning the act into a claim of responsibility. The gesture seems more important than the content. The fake Max Headroom did not terrorize Chicago. It did not cause a crisis. It caused no material damage. It left a crack in the technical confidence of local television. For 90 seconds, a broadcast operation used to controlling every second of its output lost control of its own image. Today, we are used to cyber attacks, data leaks, compromised accounts, deep fakes, and manipulated content. In 1987, that vulnerability arrived directly inside people's homes during an ordinary broadcast. The video has continued to circulate because it contains almost everything a modern legend needs: a precise date, a recognizable place, 2 real stations, a pop culture character, a technique that has never been fully clarified, a federal investigation with no result, a mask instead of a face. WTTW, one of the stations that was hit, later remembered it as an episode that remains unresolved. A story like this works precisely because of its disproportion. Sophisticated technical means, a deliberately rough result, high risk, an opaque message. In the end, what remains is that image: a fake face, dark glasses, rigid hair, a metal backdrop moving behind it, an interrupted broadcast, a sudden return to normal. The next day's newscast went on the air. Chicago continued watching television. Somewhere, though, someone knew exactly what had happened, and they never told it in a verifiable way. The Max Headroom intrusion remains in memory because it was precise, brief, and incomplete. Concrete enough to be documented, absurd enough to seem invented, unresolved enough to keep asking for attention. For 90 seconds, a mask took the place of the signal. Then it disappeared, and the name behind that mask, even today, is missing from the story.